Next up is the brilliant Talin Koutnouyan, the VP of Research and Analytics at Influential, a leading influencer marketing tech company. Now, Talin's going to teach you how to use data and consumer psychographics to create a killer marketing plan. So by the end of her talk, you'll know how to set up and practically use psychographic data for your business to skyrocket awareness, consideration, and revenue. She's worked with globally renowned brands that you know, like Time Magazine and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and we're excited for you to learn how to do this for the businesses that you work with. Talin, the stage is yours.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Talin Koutnouyan, and today I'm here to talk about how to use data and psychographics to create some killer marketing plans. Before we get into the presentation, wanted to share some background about me. I primarily help Fortune 500s, VCs, startups, drive growth and revenue with consumer data and tested strategies. So my background is purely in research and analytics, and I've worked with about 60% of the Fortune 500s. I've helped venture capital companies invest about $200 million into startups, basically trying to help inform what companies they should be investing in based on where consumer demand is going. And I've also worked with startups and helping them scale from anywhere from 0 to 25 million in annual reoccurring revenue. So that's a little bit of background about me. When, I tell people about my background, and I also do a lot of work with helping solopreneurs as well. At times, these can seem super different, right? Like working with Fortune 500, venture capital, startups, these all kind of feel like fragmented things. But in my mind, there's actually a lot of intersection between these things. And I think putting my hand in kind of all these different parts has really helped me as a professional, because I do think that one of the things that they really have in common is growth. Like, to me, I'm concerned about the intersection of how do I drive growth, whether it's a solopreneur, whether it's a Fortune 500, a startup, or a VC that's interested in investing in a startup that is one day eventually going to lead to growth. How do I drive that, right? And so that's been something that's been really top of mind for me. And I kind of like to think about it as it's not so much growth as it is mind share. Like, especially, I imagine with the audience that's listening today, mind share is really important. And mind share comes from killer marketing plans, right? When we think of a laptop, there's normally a first brand or a first product that comes to mind. In my case, it's Apple's MacBook Pro, right? When I say cell phone, there's normally a cell phone product or cell phone brand that comes to mind. In my case, it's an iPhone. And when, if I think of like a sneaker, there's normally a product that comes to mind. In this case, it's the Air Jordans, right? And so mindshare, all of these things, mindshare is built from killer marketing plans. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about today is what's needed to really create a killer marketing plan. And I would say that it's actually a killer marketing plan is the function of three things intersecting at once. It's audience, it's creative, and it's also having a solid plan for distribution. And so what do I mean by these things? Well, when you combine all of these different things together, when you're able to combine your audience strategy with your creative and with your distribution strategy, what that's really saying is your marketing plan is taking into account who is the audience, what creative are you going to be showing them? In other words, what are you going to say and show? And then finally, how are you going to reach them? And so when I think about the best marketing plans out there, they take into account these three different macro variables. You could have your audience like really lasered in, and you can have stellar creative. But if you don't have a solid distribution plan in terms of how do you reach them via paid and via other, forms of targeting, then it's not going to reach enough people. And sometimes you have a totally different scenario, right? Where you have companies are pouring marketing dollars and they're investing in paid efforts and all these different things, but their audience and creative just doesn't resonate. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here is primarily going to be focused on more of like the audience and the creative piece, to be able to kind of talk through what can be done on those two different macro variables, specifically using psychographic data to really create impact in marketing plans. So when I think about audiences, right, to me, the three audience groups that come to mind, agnostic of who your company is or what you do and what the company does, the product or the service it sells, to me, three primary audience groups come to mind. It's the sure things, the persuadables, and the lost causes. And so anytime I'm working with a company, it's really important for me to be able to identify those three different audience groups, right? There's always going to be a group of people where once they know that you exist, they'll buy from you regardless, whether they see an ad or not. It's like once they know your company is top of mind for them, they're like, yup, I need this product and I need this, or I need this specific service in my life. There's usually going to be people on the fence where it's going to take you a little bit more work to convince them to buy from you. But eventually, assuming your audience and the creative that you're surfacing them resonates, they'll eventually buy from you. And then the third final group is the lost causes, which is the importance of knowing them is so that you can avoid them. Because I wish that, we lived in this world where we all had unlimited time, money, and resources and budget. Then, maybe if you did have those things, you could try to convince them. But with most marketing plans, there's going to be a restriction in terms of budget or timing or resources. And so to know this specific audience group will allow you to better avoid them, right? It's just as important to know who not to target so that you don't waste your marketing dollars on them. And the reason why identifying these three audience groups is very important is because the first two, which is the sure things and the persuadables, those are the audience groups you want to focus on because that's what will lead to high lifetime value audiences. And think about it in this way too, is that these groups that I'm surfacing here, they're pretty broad, right? And so think about all the different micro segments that can kind of plug into these different macro categories. And those are your high lifetime value audiences that will eventually buy from you and lead to growth for your company. So the question becomes, how do you identify all these different audience groups? Well, there's so many different ways, right? And a lot of times what you'll hear are things like market research or audience segmentation or focus groups, social listening, all these things. But the thing you don't hear about as often is psychographic analysis. And so to go into details around what a psychographic analysis is, it's the needs, wants, and the emotional values of the consumer. And so one of the ways to come up with the psychographic analysis, and I'll go into more so details and examples around what this looks like specifically, but one of the things that I do is I identify like all these different consumer groups. And a lot of these groups are basically talking online about competitor products about company products. And I take that textual data and I basically, with the company that I'm at, Influential, we have an exclusive partnership with IBM Watson, which allows us to analyze psychographics of the individuals based on the social speech of their content. And so that textual data is basically taken, and based on how they speak and based on how they express themselves, we're able to gather insights in terms of who they are psychographically and not just demographically. When I first started out in marketing, one of the interesting things was that we were starting to see initial trends that demographics were no longer predictive of what consumers were going to be doing. So it's like, just because someone was a male or a female or a certain age didn't mean that they were going to take a specific action. And it was actually millennials that were key to start that specific trend. Because there was greater diversity among millennials from a psychographic standpoint, those psychographic variables became more of these leading indicators into what consumers were going to do based on their beliefs and their values and their emotional needs and wants. And so the psychographic analysis piece became, in most companies, has to be infused in more of like the traditional forms of research, whether it's social listening or audience segmentation. So the question becomes like, how do you create relevant content, right? Like now that you know like who your audience is and you know your sure things and you know your persuadables, the question becomes like, how do you create relevant content? And one of the things I like to tell my clients is you got to make noise and listen for signal or lack of signal, right? Like sometimes the absence of consumer response can also be a telling form on how well content has resonated or not. And so psychographics can really be used to inform different creative variables, right? Like what platforms you should be on, what should the media type be? Are we focusing on a static or a video? What should the imagery look like? The copy tone, the copy length. Some people prefer brevity. Other people, prefer long form text. It's like once we try to understand what different audiences prefer, then we can create content that is contextually relevant for them. And so a use case I'd like to go through is, I can't mention the company's name, but it was basically a tech company that I worked for where they release video game consoles. And so what we found is that not all gamers are equal. And so when we started the audience segmentation and we looked at it from a psychographic lens, we found that yes, there's this big overall group of gamers, but within gamers, there's different micro segments of gamers. And so the first group of gamers were what we call the experts, where they had like the highest commitment to gaming. They cared about the specific technical specifications of the console and how fast it was and what it could do, because all they wanted to do was to win, right? Like their needs were basically what we see in the bottom left-hand corner. It was around curiosity. It was around challenge. And they wanted to basically achieve. And so this was kind of like the first group, and I'll bring it full circle into what the full application was, but I'll go through the micro segments first. And the second micro segment was basically the contender. And the contender was all about having more structure and being able to achieve and being stimulated. And so all they wanted to do was the ability to compete with others. They didn't care about like the technical specifications. All they cared about was that competition element. And we identified that that was super important for them. There was a third micro segment, and I won't go through all the micro segments, but I'll talk about the main key ones. And then we can, go into detail on what the final application was. But there was a third micro segment known as the companions, where they were less concerned about the technical specifications or of the console or winning. What they really cared about was gaming provided that opportunity to bond with others. And so as you can imagine, when we have all these three different micro segments like side by side with each other, the creative that you serve them is going to look very, very different. So for the first group, because they cared about the technical specifications of the product, it was very rich with different product shots and different product angles. And that was like the focus. And the focus was on the speed of the hardware and how well the hardware performed in comparison to competitors. And the second micro segment, which was the contenders, right? And because they cared about achievement and because they cared about winning, the content and the creative that was served to them was very focused on the multiplayer element, because remember, they love to compete. And then for the companions, it was a lot of the creative was mainly focused on people gaming in a group. And because that was also super important to them, right? Like they don't care about what game they're playing. They'll play whatever game. So because it provides them the opportunity to connect with others. That's their way to connect with others. And so from a data standpoint, as you can imagine, once you identify the differences in psychographics between different microsegments, it's truly what allows you to create different types of varieties of creative and really test what's resonating with those different audiences. So one of the closing kind of questions that I normally get is like, okay, once you've identified the audience, once you identified the psychographics, and let's just say you've come up with like the different creative concepts to serve the audiences, how do you test and learn? And so one thing this is just kind of the framework that I typically like to follow, is step one for me is being able to ask myself, what marketing metric am I trying to influence? Am I trying to influence overall brand awareness? Is it a new product or service that the market doesn't know of yet? Am I trying to influence that? Or do they know about it and I'm trying to drive consideration or interest? Or are they like fully aware of it and now we're in the stage of driving sales? And so that's like step one for me. So you have to have the ability to kind of ask yourself as we go through these questions, like what specifically are the answers? The second is, and I know it doesn't sound very data informed, but this is genuinely where marketers have to start, is what is your idea? What is your guess? Or what is your prediction on how to influence this, right? This framework very closely resembles the scientific method. So you have to start with a specific guess for how you're going to be influencing that variable. It doesn't have to be right. It's just has to be something that you can learn from. And you have to, step 3 is being able to pre-evaluate the different attributes that I think are specifically important to take into account. So the first one is likelihood, right? Like how confident do you truly feel about your idea? Sometimes people have ideas, but they're like, I'm not really sure on whether this is going to work or not. Or a lot of people are talking about this and it seems to be working for a lot of people. I feel pretty confident that it's going to work for me too, just based on it making logical sense. I like to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, having low confidence in the idea, to 10, which is having the utmost confidence in the idea specifically. And the reason why I like to rate it is because keep in mind, there's not going to be one thing that you're going to test and learn. There's going to be multiple things. And so when you rate it, you will have a better sense of what you need to prioritize based on all these different variables. So that's just a tip that I like to that I like to share and that I use on my end when evaluating these different things. The second piece you need to pre-evaluate is the resources, right? So like, what do you actually need to be able to execute this idea? Is it time? Is it, resources, specific maybe people with technical capabilities? What does that look like? And then the third, of course, is money. So especially if it's going to be like a paid campaign, for example, how much money are you willing to really allocate to this idea? And a lot of times it's not the paid ads, it's also maybe production value that's like associated to creating the content. So being able to kind of have a monetary understanding of how much money it's going to take to be able to execute the idea, that will allow you to mentally prep for that and plan for that. And then impact, right? So think of it this way. If your idea was to work, how impactful do you think it would be from a marketing standpoint? And again, it's important here to be able to rate that, because probably, as you go through this framework, you're probably going to be repeating this framework multiple times for multiple different ideas. And so to be able to rank it will help you understand what you need to prioritize. Step 4 is planning the experiment details. And so the main variables that I like to plan for is, number 1, how long do you plan to run the experiment? You got to have like a sense of overall timeline, because it's important for you to know, okay, during this period, I'm going to be testing this specific idea. The second thing is, of course, like timeline, like knowing actual timeline in terms of, am I launching this before a holiday, after a holiday? having that type of consideration from a feasibility standpoint is super important. So it's both length and timeline that go hand in hand. And then people. So internally, are you going to be needing any resources, or do you need to tap into outside vendors to help accomplish some of this? And then money, right? Like, how much money are you going to be allocating at different points during the timeline? Having a clear plan around that is super important from an experiment detail standpoint. And then one of the most important things, I think, is being able to define what a successful test will look like, to be able to say, okay, this idea worked, or maybe this idea didn't work based on my original definition. See, a lot of times one of the things that marketers do is that definition of success kind of changes until after they get the results. So it's going to be super important to kind of have this like objective expectation before you go into the test and kind of see how it performed after. Step 5 is you're going to get a bunch of data, whether it's, let's just say you ran a Facebook campaign, right? Facebook data or whatever that may be. You're going to collect that data, and you're going to need to ask yourself, what happened and what did we learn? What worked, what didn't work, and why? And being able to answer those questions is super key from a framework standpoint to help kind of iterate on whether you need another test or whether you have conclusive results. And that's exactly what step 6 is did what we learn, like based on what we observed, is it conclusive, or do we need to run additional tests to continue testing this idea? So in terms of kind of going through this framework to be able to measure ideas, to be able to measure and take a data-driven approach to identifying audiences, to being able to identify psychographics and creative variables, I like to use this specific framework to really help me get a clear understanding of that. Finally, I'd like to say thank you so much for tuning in. I'm happy to answer any questions. So feel free, I'm on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me there. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of this session. Thank you so much.